Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome back to The Missing Dots. Today we're diving into a figure who is loved, debated, misunderstood, and sometimes even weaponized in arguments, Imam Musa ibn Ja'far al-Tamim, the man known as Al-Qom, the one who swallowed his anger, the prisoner saint of Baghdad. But who was he really? A spiritual giant, a political victim, a quietist, or something far more complex?
I mean, that's the ultimate question, right? Because it's a historical puzzle that has literally shaped empires. It shaped theological schools and, modern geopolitical movements too.
Yeah, absolutely.
To find the historical reality of this man, we have to look past centuries of deeply entrenched hagiography on one side, and then on the exact opposite side, highly aggressive state propaganda.
Right, and that is exactly the mission for us today. For you listening right now, the goal is we want to cut through the noise.
Exactly, we have to.
We are putting 100 critical, incredibly dense, and sometimes intensely controversial questions about this 8th century figure right here on the table. We've pulled together an enormous stack of sources to do this too.
We really have. I mean, we're looking at classical historical chronicles from Al-Tabari and Al-Masudi, right?
Yeah, and we are digging into the theological debates from both early and modern scholars. Plus, we're examining some pretty sharp critiques from ex-Muslims and atheist historians too.
Which is super important for balance. And we are relying heavily on rigorous academic analyses from modern historians, people like Najm Haider and Wilfred Madelung.
Because we want to understand how a man who spent much of his adult life locked in a pitch-black Baghdad dungeon, how does he continue to influence the theology, the political architecture, and really the very heartbeat of the Islamic world today?
Right. But before we get into the timeline of his life, it is crucial to establish the ground rules for how we are approaching this source material.
Yeah, let's lay that out clearly.
We are not here to take a sectarian side at all. We're not here to tell you what to believe. Our function is to synthesize this massive array of historical and theological sources impartially.
Right.
So we will lay out the 12-verse Shia perspective, which views him as the divinely appointed, infallible 7th Imam.
Mm-hmm.
We will also present the Sunni historical view, which reveres him as a deeply pious scholar and a thoroughly trustworthy hadith transmitter, but structurally rejects the concept of a divine imam entirely.
And we'll look at the Zaidi and Ismaili objections.
Right.
Right, because they historically challenged his leadership from within the broader Shia umbrella.
Exactly. And we will confront modern, secular, and rationalist critiques head-on. The intention is to give you the full 360-degree context so you can see all the missing dots for yourself.
Okay, so let's start by looking at the young man who was thrust into one of the most chaotic, dangerous leadership vacuums in early Islamic history.
It really was a vacuum.
Yeah, so we are starting in the year 745 CE. He is born in a place called Al-Abwa, which is, it's a village situated on the route between Mecca and Medina.
Right.
But the circumstances of his birth are fascinating right out of the gate.
Yeah.
His mother, Hamida al-Barbariya, was a freed slave from North Africa.
Yeah, which is huge.
She wasn't just a concubine who faded into the background of a noble household. She became an incredibly respected hadith transmitter in her own right. SubhanAllah, this alone completely challenges the rigid, Arab-centric elitist views of lineage of the time.
It does. The socio-political context of that detail is just profound. I mean, if you look at the Umayyad era, which was just ending.
Right, they were collapsing.
Exactly. And the early Abbasid era, which was just beginning, the society was heavily, heavily stratified. Arab tribal nobility was everything.
Like tracing your bloodline back to specific Qurayshi or Yamani tribes?
Yes, exactly. If you couldn't do that, you were effectively a second-class citizen. Non-Arab converts, known as the Mawali, were often treated terribly.
Wow.
So, by having a freed North African slave as the mother of the individual who would eventually be designated as the next leader, his father, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, was making a massive theological and social statement.
He was basically saying lineage isn't the point.
Exactly. He was actively dismantling the racial and tribal prejudices of the time, reinforcing the Quranic principle that piety outranks lineage.
Which sets the stage for a leader who inherently bridges different worlds.
Yeah.
But the real chaos, like the defining crucible of his early life, doesn't begin at his birth.
No, it begins in 765 CE.
Right, with the death of his father. Because during that transition between the Umayyad and Abbasid empires, Ja'far al-Sadiq had capitalized on the political distraction to build this massive intellectual university in Medina.
He had thousands of students. It was unprecedented.
Yeah, but when he passed away, that cohesive community suddenly shattered into pieces.
The fracture was devastating. I mean, it was a full-blown succession crisis, and understanding the mechanics of this split is essential for understanding everything Musa al-Kazim would face.
So let's walk through the competing claims.
Okay, so the eldest son of Jafar Sadiq was a man named Ismail. However, Ismail had actually died while his father was still alive.
Okay, so he's out of the picture physically.
Right, physically. But despite his death, a significant group of followers claim that the imamat, the divine leadership, either remained with Ismail in some esoteric spiritual sense or passed directly through him to his son, Muhammad ibn Ismail.
And this is the exact moment the Ismaili sect splits off from the rest of the Shia community, right?
Yeah.
The group that eventually founds the Fatimid Empire and continues today under the Aga Khan.
Yes, exactly. They argued based on the premise that the designation of an imam cannot be altered, which ties into complex theological debates about divine will.
Right, but that wasn't the only split.
Far from it. You had another older brother, Abdullah al-Afta. Abdullah claimed the imam based on a very traditional, deeply ingrained Arabian customary principle age.
Because he was the oldest surviving son when his father died.
Exactly. So by standard tribal logic, he should be the undisputed leader. And a massive portion of the community, known as the Fatiyah sect, initially followed him.
Honestly, if you look at it from the perspective of an average person living in Medina at the time, following the eldest surviving son makes complete practical sense.
It was the default.
Right, it's like a massive company founder dying, and instead of the eldest son taking over, a younger sibling is secretly named the heir. That causes the board to completely fracture. It's how almost every other institution functioned back then.
It is, but Twelver Shia theology operates on a completely different premise. They believe that Musa was chosen by Nas.
Nas being the divine designation.
Right. Nas is the specific, explicit divine designation by the previous imam. According to this framework, the imam isn't an inheritance that passes down like a piece of property to the oldest child.
So it's an appointment independent of birth order.
Exactly. And the sources show a massive fundamental divide in how this historical moment is interpreted.
Yeah, because if you read secular academics, historians like W. Ivanhoe or modern sociologists looking at early Islamic sects, they look at this 765 CE moment and see a messy, highly political succession dispute.
They see factions scrambling for power.
Right. They see the prominent followers of Jafar al-Sadiq scrambling for control of the community's immense social capital and, frankly, their financial assets.
But the Twelver Shia theological view frames this completely differently. They view this fracture not as a political failure, but as a necessary period of divine testing.
Like a filtration process.
Yes, exactly, where the true imam emerged not by force or by political maneuvering, but by demonstrating superior, undeniable knowledge.
Because classical Twelver sources heavily emphasize that knowledge ilm is the ultimate empirical proof of the imamat, right?
Absolutely. There are detailed historical accounts where Abdullah al-Afta is subjected to intense jurisprudence tests by his father's topmost senior students.
Like pop quizzes on Islamic law.
Sort of, but incredibly complex. We are talking about highly complex questions regarding Islamic law, perhaps intricate fractions of inheritance law or obscure rulings on ritual purity.
And he fails them.
According to these accounts, yes. Abdullah fails to answer them accurately. The scholars then turn to the younger Musa, and he answers them flawlessly.
Demonstrating an inherent unlearned mastery.
Right, demonstrating the divine law.
But here's where I have to push back. Honestly, if his closest companions believed he had this undeniable divine light, how do you end up with 3 different sects the minute his father dies?
That's a fair question.
I mean, that doesn't sound like clear divine guidance to me. If the Imanity is supposed to be the ultimate anchor for the believers, why were the most God-fearing, educated companions of Jafar al-Sadiq wandering around Medina, completely confused about who to give their allegiance to?
And that is the exact critique raised by modern skeptics and secular historians. They argue that if the Nas was public and clear, the schisms wouldn't have happened.
Right.
But if we expand our lens to look at the macro-political environment of Abbasid paranoia, the Twelver theological defense becomes highly contextualized.
How so?
The confusion wasn't a failure of communication, it was a deliberate, engineered survival tactic.
Wait, really? A survival tactic?
Yes.
Yeah.
The environment in Medina at the time was suffocating. The Abbasid Caliph, al-Mansur, the man who built Baghdad, had an expansive, ruthless network of spies deeply embedded in Medina.
Okay.
He sent a direct letter to his governor in Medina with a very specific, chilling order, he said. find out who Jafar al-Sadiq named as his successor in his will, and behead him immediately.
Wow. Which leads to one of the most brilliant high-stakes political maneuvers I've read in these historical chronicles.
It's genius.
Jafar al-Sadiq obviously knew this assassination order was inevitable, right? So he wrote a legal will naming 5 different people as the joint executors of his estate.
He named the Caliph al-Mansur himself.
Right. And the Abbasid governor of Medina, his eldest surviving son Abdullah, his wife Hamida, and his son Musa. He intentionally completely obfuscated the succession.
And when the governor read this will and reported back to the Caliph in Baghdad, al-Mansur reportedly threw his hands up in frustration and said, "There is no way to kill these people."
Because he couldn't execute himself.
Exactly. He couldn't execute himself, he couldn't execute his own governor, and killing the rest would have been an unjustified political disaster without knowing who the actual spiritual successor was.
So the ambiguity that confused the sincere followers in Medina was the exact same ambiguity that saved Musa al-Kadim's life.
Yes, the confusion was a vital feature, not a bug. It was a community trying to operate under a brutal surveillance state.
The thing is, surviving that initial assassination attempt was just the beginning.
Oh, absolutely. It only got harder.
Because his leadership was internally contested by his brother's followers, and his life was constantly under threat from the overarching Abbasid state. He had to adopt a radically different approach to wielding influence.
An approach that critics often heavily mistake for weakness.
Right. And this brings us to a philosophy, a way of moving through the world. Let's deconstruct his primary title. He is almost universally known today as al-Khatim.
Linguistically, al-Khatim translates to the one who swallows or restrains his anger. It comes from a Quranic description of the righteous.
It's a very evocative title.
It is. It's a profound psychological, spiritual, and ultimately political title. The historical sources, and it is important to note that this is consistent across both Sunni and Shia texts, are filled with anecdotes illustrating this exceptional forbearance.
Even prominent Sunni scholars recognize this, right?
Yes, the prominent Sunni scholar Ibn Hajar al-Haythami explicitly highlights his patience and his immense capacity for forgiveness as his defining traits.
The Shia sources are just packed with these incredibly vivid, almost cinematic stories about this.
Oh, definitely.
There's a famous account about a man in Medina, descendant of the second caliph, who actively despised the al-Baytid.
He hated them.
He would deliberately wait for Musa al-Khatim to pass by in the street, or he would seek him out and just publicly hurl abuse, slander, and insults at him.
Right, in public.
Yeah. The Imam's followers, who were fiercely loyal, wanted to retaliate. They asked for permission to physically silence the man or punish him for his insolence. But al-Khatim explicitly forbade it.
He wouldn't let them touch him.
Instead, he found out where this man worked on a farm outside the city limits. The Imam rode his mule out to the farm, literally trampling through the crops.
Which probably made the guy furious.
Oh, the man started yelling at him for ruining the harvest. But the Imam calmly approached him, asked him how much he expected to make from the harvest, and then handed him a purse of gold coins that far exceeded the expected profit.
And he spoke to him with intense, disarming kindness.
Exactly. And the man was so overwhelmed by this psychological reversal, expecting violence and receiving immense generosity, that he immediately wept, apologized, and changed his allegiance.
He went from a bitter public enemy into a vocal defender.
It's an incredible story.
It is, but the interpretation of these specific stories serves as a fascinating dividing line in the historiography.
How so?
Well, for the Twelver Shia, this story is the absolute pinnacle of moral exemplarity. It is empirical proof of his divine character, demonstrating an absolute mastery over the human ego.
But there's another side to it.
Yes, if we pivot and look at the Zaydi Shia perspective, we see a very heavy structural critique. The Zaydis, another prominent branch of Shi'ism, believe fundamentally that a true imam must actively fight tyranny with a sword.
So they looked back to figures like Imam Hussein at Karbala.
Exactly, or the revolt of Zayd ibn Ali in 740 CE. To a Zaydi scholar of the 8th century, al-Khatim's political quietism, his refusal to raise an army against the Abbasids, was a failure of leadership.
Because he wasn't physically fighting back.
Right. They argue that by not leading an armed revolt, by choosing to hand out gold purses instead of forging swords, he essentially provided tacit de facto legitimization to the oppressive Abbasid regime.
And it isn't just a medieval Zaydi critique either. If you read modern secular critics or analyze the discussions by ex-Muslims in online historical forums today, they often frame this exact same behavior as political cowardice.
They see it as a coping mechanism.
Exactly. They argue that his forgiveness and his swallowing of anger were just the learned helplessness of a man who was entirely outgunned by the state apparatus, like he was trying to reframe his inability to fight as a spiritual virtue.
Which brings us to the core theological defense utilized by Twelver scholarship to explain this behavior, the concept of taqiyya.
Or precautionary dissimulation.
Yes. Critics and polemicists often translate taqiyya simply as lying or passive compliance, but classical scholars like Sheikh al-Mufid and modern political theorists within the Shia tradition frame it very differently.
It's more strategic than that.
Much more. It is viewed as a highly calculated strategic doctrine of survival. A vital framework to understand this is the concept of the 250-year-old man, which was articulated by modern figures like Ayatollah Khamenei.
Okay, break that down for us. What is the 250-year-old man?
This theory posits that all the imams, from the prophet's death to the occultation of the 12th imam, should not be viewed as disconnected individuals with conflicting strategies.
Okay.
Rather, they were effectively one continuous, unified political and spiritual entity living for 250 years. They were just adopting vastly different tactical approaches based entirely on the specific socio-political conditions of their specific era.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So, under that framework, while Imam Hussein's specific era required the absolute shock of a bloody martyrdom to wake up a spiritually deadened community, al-Qadim's era required absolute preservation.
Precisely the argument. A kinetic revolt against the entrenched peak superpower of the Abbasid Empire under al-Mansur or later Harun al-Rashid wouldn't just have failed militarily.
It would have been suicide.
It would have meant the total biological and intellectual annihilation of the al-Bayt and the complete eradication of their followers.
So his quietism was not passivity.
No, it was a long-term educational jihad. It was about preserving the complex theology, the jurisprudence, and the underground social network in an era where public political confrontation meant certain pointless death.
It's actually pretty simple when you think about it, like a high-level chess match.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, because sometimes refusing to move your king from the back rank is the only way to avoid an immediate checkmate. You let the opponent exhaust their pieces, you let them drain their resources trying to find an opening, while you subtly control the board's tension from a seemingly static defensive position.
That's exactly how it functioned.
But honestly, let me play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
At what point does strategic silence just look exactly like compliance to the average person suffering under a tyrant?
It's a very thin line.
Right. If I am a poor, heavily taxed farmer in Kufa, watching my neighbors being flogged by a corrupt Abbasid governor, and the man claiming to be the infallible divine guide is sitting quietly in Medina, sending gifts to people who insult him, doesn't that just normalize my oppression?
That is a sharp, profoundly valid historical critique. And honestly, it is the exact tension that drove many sincere believers toward the more militant Zaidi factions.
Because they wanted action.
Right. It's the eternal tension between ideological purity and necessary political pragmatism. But to truly understand the weight of his silence, we have to look at how the Abbasid state itself interpreted it.
They didn't see it as compliance, did they?
Not at all. Because to caliphs like al-Mahdi and later Harun al-Rashid, al-Qadim's silence was deafening. You have to remember the foundational justification for the Abbasid Empire.
They claimed to be the rightful heirs, too.
Exactly. They didn't just conquer territory. They justified their massive empire by claiming they were the true representatives of the Prophet's family, deriving their legitimacy from their descent from the Prophet's uncle, Abbas.
So Musa al-Kazim, as a direct descendant of the Prophet through his daughter Fatima and cousin Ali, was a living problem for them.
He represented a walking, breathing theological refutation of the Abbasid claim to ultimate legitimacy.
He didn't need to raise a sword or print revolutionary pamphlets. His actual DNA was a rebellion.
That is exactly how the state viewed him. He actively refused to give religious legitimacy to their rule. He engaged in a profound soft power resistance.
Like boycotting their institutions.
Exactly. He wouldn't pray behind their state-appointed judges, he wouldn't endorse their aggressive taxation systems, and he wouldn't offer religious blessings for their expansionist wars.
That quiet, unwavering, structural refusal to fall in line must have been infuriating for the caliphs.
It terrified the Abbasid state far more than an armed rebellion would have. An armed rebellion can be physically crushed with a professional army, and the rebels labeled as traitors.
Right.
But how do you crush a man whose only tangible weapon is the fact that millions of people quietly believe he is inherently holier and more deserving of your throne than you are?
Well, the Abbasid caliphs figured out their answer to that exact question, unfortunately.
They did.
Because if you can't crush him on the battlefield, and you can't out-argue him in a theological debate, you erase him. You lock him in the dark.
And that begins the darkest chapter of his life.
Exactly. This exact quiet defiance, this refusal to legitimize the state, is what forced their hand. If you can't break a man's influence in the open, you bury him alive. So let's examine the Abbasid shadow in the prison years.
To understand the crushing severity of this period, we need to trace the sequence of caliphs he had to navigate. He survived al-Mansur, who was ruthlessly consolidating power and building the foundation of the state.
Okay.
Then came al-Mahdi, who was actually the first caliph to physically arrest al-Kazim and drag him from Medina to Baghdad.
Though he let him go eventually, right?
Yes. He later released him after reportedly having a terrifying dream warning him against harming the imam. Then came a brief, highly tense period under the Caliph al-Hadi, but it was under the infamous Harun al-Rashid that the state's paranoia regarding the Alid threat reached its absolute zenith.
Harun al-Rashid is this towering, almost legendary figure in Western and Islamic history. He's the Caliph of the Arabian Nights, the man who exchanged gifts with Charlemagne, ruling over this glittering golden age of wealth, translation movements, and scientific inquiry.
A true global superpower at the time.
Right, but the historical sources, both Sunni and Shia, paint a parallel picture of a hand consumed by intense, gnawing political paranoia.
He was terrified of losing his throne.
Now, to be fair to the historical context, Harun didn't just target Shia figures. The Sunni historical sources vividly document that even Imam Malik, the revered founder of the Maliki school of jurisprudence in Medina, was publicly flogged by the Abbasid state.
The comparison with Imam Malik is really crucial for understanding the specific nature of the threat al-Kazim posed. Imam Malik was severely punished. His arm was reportedly dislocated, actually.
Oh, wow, dislocated.
Yes, and it was because he issued a fatwa stating that an oath of divorce taken under duress is invalid.
Wait, how is a ruling on divorce political?
Because the state interpreted this as a veiled political ruling, suggesting that oaths of allegiance to the Abbasid Caliph, which were often extracted under threat of violence, were also religiously invalid.
Oh, wow. I see.
But Malik was eventually left alone because Malik wasn't a dynastic threat. He was a brilliant scholar, but he didn't claim the throne.
Whereas al-Kazim?
Al-Kazim, on the other hand, was the head of an underground, heavily funded community that believed he should be sitting on Harun's throne by divine right.
And there was a direct confrontation between them, wasn't there?
Yes. There is a famous, highly illustrative debate recorded in the Chronicles between al-Kazim and Harun at the Prophet's tomb in Medina.
How did that play out?
Harun approached the tomb surrounded by his royal entourage and loudly proclaimed, "Peace be upon you, O Messenger of Allah, O my cousin." He was publicly flexing his blood tie to the Prophet to legitimize his rule to the masses.
A total PR move.
Exactly. But al-Kazim calmly stepped up next to him and said, "Peace be upon you, O Messenger of Allah, O my father."
Oh, man. That is incredible. He just instantly, effortlessly, checkmated Harun's entire claim to absolute legitimacy right in front of his own court.
And the sources note that Harun's face visibly changed color. The tension was palpable. He realized in that specific moment that as long as Musa al-Kazim was walking free, engaging with the public, the Abbasid grip on power was ideologically fragile.
So that was the turning point.
It was, and so began a grueling, relentless cycle of arrests and imprisonments. Modern historical estimates suggest he spent around 14 years in various dungeons.
The reality of that confinement, when you read the descriptions of 8th century Abbasid prisons, is just bleak.
Yeah.
He wasn't just put under comfortable house arrest in a palace.
No, it was dark, solitary confinement often.
He was actively, systematically shuffled around the empire to break him psychologically and to break his followers' morale. They moved him from Basra to various locations in Baghdad, and the historical accounts of these transfers reveal something extraordinary about his character.
What happened with his jailers is fascinating.
Right. He would be handed over to a high-ranking jailer, someone like Isa ibn Jafar in Basra. Isa was tasked with keeping him locked away. But after a few months, Isa would write desperate letters to the caliph saying, essentially, "You need to take this man away from me immediately."
Because the imam wasn't fighting him.
Exactly. Isa wrote, "I spy on him, I listen to him pray in the dark all night. He never curses you, he never prays for your destruction, he just prays for God's mercy and forgiveness. If you don't send someone to take him, I'm going to open the doors and set him free myself because the guilt is destroying me."
That specific pattern repeated itself continuously. The state kept having to transfer the imam because his previous guards, the very people paid to cage and break him, kept becoming mesmerized by his profound piety and asceticism.
It's a staggering testament to the gravity of his moral presence.
It is. The Abbasids were desperately trying to isolate him from society, but his spiritual authority was so contagious that it kept compromising the state's own security apparatus.
So what did Harun do?
Eventually, Harun realized he couldn't trust regular nobles to hold him. He had to hand him over to a man named Sindi ibn Shahik.
He's the police chief, right?
Yes, a notoriously brutal, uncompromising police chief in Baghdad who had no such moral qualms and was fiercely loyal only to the state.
And the sources note that throughout this brutal 14-year period, he was actually offered his freedom multiple times. High-ranking state officials or emissaries of the caliph would come to his cell and offer him a deal.
A very tempting deal for a man in a dungeon.
Right. They would say, just say the word, just publicly acknowledge Harun's legitimacy, just accept a state pension to show you are under our patronage, and you can walk out of here today. You can go back to your family in Medina.
And he refused every single time.
Which makes me think of modern political dissidents. Figures like an Alexei Navalny or a Nelson Mandela. Their mere existence in a jail cell, their absolute refusal to break or compromise their core principles becomes a bigger, more destabilizing threat to an authoritarian regime than a free man commanding an army.
The theological framework of the Imam dictates that the Imam cannot legitimize a usurper, even to save his own life, if doing so would permanently corrupt the religion itself.
It's a non-negotiable principle.
Exactly. The refusal to legitimize the oppressor is a central, non-negotiable tenet of their ethical system.
But if you look at the rationalist, atheist, or secular critiques of this entire narrative, if he genuinely had the supernatural knowledge, the ilm, or the divine protection that later Twelver sources claim, why didn't he just escape?
That's the classic question.
We read these hagiographic accounts of chains miraculously falling off, or him knowing the unseen intentions of his guards. Why let his family suffer the agony of his absence? Why let his followers be persecuted and hunted down while he sat in a dark cell for over a decade?
It is the most common rationalist critique leveled against the concept of the imamate, and it requires a deeper look into Shia theology to understand the response.
Okay, what's the theological response?
The scholarly defense articulated masterfully by modern thinkers like Al-Amat Tabatabai clarifies the exact nature of divine protection, or isma.
Infallibility.
Right. Isma means protection from committing sin or error in delivering religious guidance. It absolutely does not mean a magical, superhero-like shield against the physical laws of nature or worldly suffering. In fact, in Islamic theology broadly, the greatest figures, the prophets and the imams, are expected to suffer the most severe worldly trials.
So escaping would have undermined his purpose.
Exactly. If Musa al-Kazim had used a miracle to simply teleport out of prison, it would have entirely negated the purpose of the trial. His willing, conscious endurance of the prison cell, his profound patience, his saber became the ultimate empirical proof of his moral superiority over the corrupt, luxurious, and ultimately hollow Abbasid court.
He proved to the historical record that true divine authority cannot be chained by iron. But just because he was physically locked in a Baghdad dungeon, chained in the dark, doesn't mean he stopped leading. And in fact, here's where the history gets incredibly fascinating.
It really does.
Because his long-term imprisonment birthed one of the most sophisticated, decentralized underground networks in medieval history. Let's talk about the Wakala system.
The Wakala system, or the agency. It is arguably Musa al-Kazim's greatest, most enduring administrative achievement, and it fundamentally altered the structural trajectory of Shi'ism forever.
How did he build it from a prison cell?
Well, because the imam was physically isolated and under constant surveillance, he had to figure out how to guide a rapidly expanding community spread across vast geographical distances. We're talking from Iraq and Iran all the way down to the Hejaz and Yemen.
That's a massive territory.
It is. So he systematically appointed highly trusted, deeply educated deputies known as Wukala to act as his direct representatives in different regional hubs.
If you're listening to this and wondering how an underground tax and legal system from 1,200 years ago actually functioned, the logistics are straight out of an espionage novel.
They really are.
They used secret pockets sewn intricately into the linings of garments. They use heavily encrypted language in their letters. A follower in Nishapur might ask a complex theological question. They would hand it to their local deputy.
Right, and that deputy would arrange for it to be smuggled into Baghdad.
Passed to the prison guards, who had been spiritually flipped by the Imam's piety. And weeks later, a written, authoritative ruling would come back, often using pseudonyms.
They would refer to the Imam as the old man or the scholar to throw off the Abbasid censors.
But more importantly than just answering legal questions, this network collected religious taxes. Specifically, the Khums, the 20% religious tax on surplus wealth, which they managed to collect and move right under the noses of the Abbasid tax collectors.
The financial logistics of the Wakala system were its most critical and honestly its most dangerous aspect.
Because of the sheer amount of money.
Exactly. The Khums provided the essential economic lifeblood for the survival of the Shia community. It funded the poor, it supported the widows and orphans of those executed by the Abbasid state, and it allowed the sprawling scholarly network to survive and propagate the teachings of the Al-Bayt.
But as you can imagine, from a purely historical and sociological perspective, anytime you have massive amounts of untraceable wealth flowing through an underground, heavily compartmentalized network, you invite severe scrutiny from the state.
And severe internal temptation.
Right. So the secular and atheist critique naturally zeroes in on this exact point. They ask, was Musa al-Kazim just a spiritual figurehead locked in a cell, while a corrupt elite of middle managers amassed massive wealth and political power in his name?
And Abbasid state propaganda absolutely pushed this exact narrative.
Yeah. They claimed that the Alids weren't pious victims. They were hoarding gold, building a rival untaxed state treasury to eventually buy weapons and hire mercenaries to overthrow the caliphate.
The Abbasids aggressively utilized that narrative to justify his ongoing imprisonment to the broader Muslim public.
But was it true?
Well, the historical reality, which is corroborated remarkably even by Sunni historians who had no theological stake in his imam, like Ibn Khaldun, completely contradicts the idea of personal hoarding or corruption by the imam himself.
Okay, so he wasn't living in luxury.
Not at all. Musa al-Kazim was incredibly ascetic. Before his imprisonment, he was known throughout Medina as Zahir al-Muruwa, the one of manifest virtue and chivalry.
What did that look like in practice?
He was famous for tying up small leather bags containing 200 to 300 dinars and secretly leaving them at the doors of the impoverished in the middle of the night, ensuring his identity remained hidden so as not to embarrass the recipients. Alhamdulillah, he turned state money into pure charity.
So, the historical defense, corroborated by some Sunni historians, is that he wasn't hoarding this money at all, but actively distributing it. He lived in absolute voluntary poverty while managing vast transnational wealth for the community.
Exactly. He wasn't benefiting from it personally.
It's actually pretty simple when you think about it, like a decentralized autonomous organization, a DAO on a blockchain today.
Oh, that's a very modern way to look at it.
Yeah, you have a protocol, which in this case is the theological framework and the religious requirement of the Khums tax. But you don't have a centralized physical bank for the Abbasids to raid.
Right, because it's dispersed.
You have nodes, the Wakala spread across different geographical regions. The network runs smoothly. The resources are distributed to where they are needed, and the system functions and remains anti-fragile even if the founder is completely offline or locked in a dungeon.
The DAO analogy is structurally very accurate. He engineered a decentralized religious infrastructure that could survive the decapitation of its leadership.
But human nature is still human nature.
Always.
When you build a massive financial network that relies entirely on middlemen handling literal piles of untraceable silver and gold cash, while the ultimate boss is locked up and out of sight, aren't you just begging for those agents to eventually become corrupt?
And that is the profound, tragic irony of the Wakala system. Your analysis of the incentive structure is historically spot on.
Because it collapsed.
Well, Harun al-Rashid feared the economic independence of the Shia, which is exactly why he tried to crush it. But the real existential threat to the system wasn't the caliph in Baghdad. It was the unchecked greed of the agents themselves.
Wow.
And that exact decentralized financial structure laid the groundwork for a massive, devastating theological schism, the literal moment the imam took his last breath.
This naturally shifts us to the absolute chaos that erupted when the Wakala system's agents had to finally reckon with the imam's death. Let's talk about the Waqiyah.
The Waqifiyah, which translates roughly to the cessationists or those who stopped.
Why are they called that?
When Musa al-Kazim finally died in prison in 799 CE, several of his top, most historically trusted financial agentsmen who had been managing the Khums network for years refused to acknowledge his death.
They just denied it.
Yes, they publicly claimed that he hadn't died at all. Instead, they argued he had gone into a state of occultation, that he was the prophesied hidden Mahdi who would return at the end of times to fill the earth with justice.
Okay.
Therefore, they argued, the line of imams stopped with him. They entirely rejected the succession of his designated son, Ali al-Rida.
It is a wild historical moment. I mean, these are guys who were his hand-picked deputies, and modern secular historians and even traditional classical Shia scholars like Sheikh al-Tusi actually agree completely on the underlying motive here.
It was entirely financial.
Yeah. It wasn't some deep, profound theological misunderstanding of his teachings. It was a massive, coordinated embezzlement scheme.
It was. These agents, prominent figures like Ali ibn Abi Hamza al-Batani, had amassed literally millions of dirhams, tens of thousands of dinars in Qum's money while the imam was locked up.
We're talking about the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's purchasing power.
Huge amounts of wealth.
If they acknowledged that Musa al-Kazim was dead and that his son Ali al-Rida was the new legitimate imam, they would be religiously obligated to hand over all that cash and all their regional power to the new leader.
Which they didn't want to do.
Right. So they simply said, nope, he's not dead, he's the Mahdi, and we are still his authorized financial managers.
It was a devastating existential crisis for the early Shia community. The Waqifiyya weren't just a small fringe group of radicals.
Because they had all that money.
Exactly. They were heavily funded by the embezzled wealth. They commanded significant social respect. Because of their previous proximity to al-Khatim, they actively produced their own forged hadith collections to justify their new beliefs, and they managed to confuse and siphon off a significant portion of the community for decades.
It makes me think of modern conspiracy theories where followers absolutely refuse to believe a cultural icon is dead.
Like
the Elvis sightings, fueled by massive cognitive dissonance. But instead of just tabloid magazines, you have millions of dollars and eternal religious salvation on the line. The financial incentive completely hijacked their theology.
The sociological and psychological parallels are striking. When a charismatic leader dies unexpectedly, or in this case out of public view in a secret prison, psychological denial combined with a massive financial motive becomes an incredibly powerful catalyst for schism.
This brings us to the broader theological disputes surrounding his legacy, specifically the tension between miracles and rationality.
Right, because the stories about him are incredible.
Yeah, classical 12er Shia texts are full of accounts of Karamat miracles attributed to him. Speaking to animals, knowing foreign languages he never formally learned, predicting the exact future actions of his jailers.
And Sunni scholars, as we mentioned earlier, respect him highly, but not for miracles.
Exactly. They view him as a thika, a thoroughly trustworthy narrator of hadith, but they completely reject the ideas of infallibility and these supernatural miracle claims.
And secular historians take it a step further.
Right. If you read modern secular academics or ex-Muslims, they view these stories as standard hagiographical legend-building myths constructed retroactively by his followers to keep a persecuted, frightened cult together.
The academic perspective, championed by scholars like Nojam Haider, argues that early Islamic historical writing is inherently rhetoricized.
What does that mean in this context?
What this means is that the historical texts aren't just dry recordings of facts, they are arguments. The stories told about al-Khaim by his followers were specifically designed to prove his divine status against competing claims, just as Abbasid court histories were meticulously designed to prove caliphal legitimacy.
So they were weaponized narratives.
Exactly. From an academic viewpoint, the miracles serve as a theological anchor, a coping mechanism for a community suffering severe trauma and persecution.
But wait. If his teachings were supposedly crystal clear, if he was an infallible guide directly appointed by God with perfect judgment, how could his own hand-picked deputies, the guys he personally chose to run his network, twist his death into a completely new, corrupt sect?
That's a huge theological tension.
Doesn't that suggest his communication or his judgment of human character wasn't as perfect as the theology claims?
It is a very rigorous theological challenge, and the 12er Shia scholarly response to this is deeply nuanced.
How do they explain it?
Well, infallibility, isma, protects an imam from committing sin or error in conveying the divine message. However, it absolutely does not strip free will, the capacity for greed, or the potential for hypocrisy from his followers.
So the followers are still flawed humans.
Right. In Islamic theology, the prophets and the imams are bound to judge people by their outward actions, their zahir. leaving the judgment of their hidden intentions, their baton, to God.
Which is pretty consistent with earlier Islamic history.
Exactly. This directly mirrors how the Prophet Muhammad himself interacted with known hypocrites in Medina. The Waqifiyya split is not viewed as a failure of the Imam's judgment in appointing them, but as a harsh, necessary test of faith for the broader community.
A purification process.
Yes. The community had to learn to follow the truth of the Imam, represented by the designated son, Ali al-Rida, and not just blindly follow the charismatic individuals who handle the money.
That makes a lot of sense.
In many ways, Shia theology views the Waqifiyya crisis as a vital preparation for the eventual permanent occultation of the 12th Imam later on, teaching the community to rely on principles rather than physical access.
While the Waqifiyya agents were trying to deny his death for their own financial gain, the physical reality of his martyrdom was undeniable to the people of Baghdad. And that martyrdom cemented a legacy that is literally shaping Middle Eastern geopolitics today. Let's look at the end of his life and how that legacy echoes into the present.
The end came in the year 799 CE, or 183 AH.
So he had been in prison for a long time at this point.
Yes. After years of the Imam refusing to yield and the guards continuing to be influenced by his piety, Harun al-Rashid finally decided that the Imam's mere existence was too great a liability to tolerate.
He had to be eliminated.
Exactly. The historical consensus among Shia scholars, and a view accepted as highly probable by many secular historians given the standard operating procedures of the Abbasid state, is that he was poisoned.
The accounts say that Sindi ibn Shaikh, his brutal jailer, served him poisoned dates. After several days of severe agony, he passed away in his cell. But the Abbasids were terrified of the public backlash, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely terrified.
They knew they had just murdered a direct descendant of the Prophet, a man revered by thousands across the city. So they engaged in a massive, morbid public relations campaign.
They orchestrated a highly public viewing. Sindi ibn Shaikh had the Imam's body brought out and placed publicly on the main bridge of Baghdad.
Just left out on the bridge.
What they called the local judges, the medical examiners of the time, the elite of the city, and the general public to come and inspect the body.
To prove what?
They repeatedly announced to the crowds, look, there are no sword wounds, no signs of strangulation, no marks of torture. He died a natural death. The caliph has done nothing wrong.
It's chilling. They paraded his body to prove their innocence, to quell any potential uprisings.
Right, but it backfired in a way.
Yeah, because by putting him on the bridge, they inadvertently created a massive focal point for public mourning. His followers, and even regular citizens of Baghdad who respected his piety, eventually took his body and buried it in the Quraysh cemetery on the outskirts of the city.
And that modest burial site became the nucleus for what is now the massive, sprawling city of Khatimiyya.
Right, but his legacy goes far beyond a physical, geographical location. His life, his suffering, and his strategic choices have become foundational texts for modern Islamic political theory, specifically within Shiism.
It's heavily debated even today.
This is where the history gets incredibly relevant to the news we watch today. You have his legacy of quietism, of patient endurance, of refusing to launch a suicidal revolt. Today, that exact model is cited by traditionalist, quietist Shia authorities.
Like who?
The perfect modern example is Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf, Iraq. He follows the model that clerics should be moral guides, a spiritual safety net for the people, advising the masses, but they should not be the political rulers directly running the government machinery.
On the other hand, you have the exact opposite political conclusion drawn from the exact same historical life.
How so?
Activists, and specifically the architects of Iran's Walayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist, championed by figures like Ayatollah Khomeini, look at al-Khatim's immense suffering and draw a revolutionary conclusion.
You see it as a call to action.
Exactly. They argue that his imprisonment and murder definitively prove that as long as secular, oppressive states exist, the al-Bayt and their followers will inevitably be crushed.
Oh, so they have to take control to protect themselves.
Yeah, precisely. Therefore, they argue, to prevent such persecution from ever happening again, the clerics must actively take political power and establish an Islamic state. His suffering in the dungeon becomes the ultimate ideological justification for resisting oppressive states today and seizing the apparatus of power.
It's a historical Rorschach test. People look at his life, they look at those 14 brutal years in a dungeon, and they see whatever political justification they need for the present moment.
They project their own ideology onto him.
Right. The quietist sees the divine virtue of patience. The revolutionary sees the absolute necessity of seizing power to protect the faith. But considering how fiercely he protected his community by actively avoiding open warfare and sectarian bloodshed, has the reverence for him ironically turned into the exact kind of sectarian political weapon he spent his entire life trying to avoid?
That's the tragic question.
We see his name invoked in modern conflicts. We see historical grievances weaponized. Is the legacy escaping the man?
It is the ultimate tragedy of historical greatness, the sheer impossibility of controlling one's legacy after death. The truth is, his legacy is deeply multivalent.
Meaning it changes based on who is looking at it.
Exactly. To a secular historian, he is a fascinating case study in underground network building, cryptography, and surviving aggressive state persecution.
Right.
To a Sunni Muslim, he is a highly respected scholar and a tragic victim of dynastic cruelty. To a Shia Muslim, he is the infallible proof of God on earth who willingly endured the unendurable to preserve the true faith. MashaAllah.
It's a massive legacy.
It is, but stripped of all specific sectarian labels, his life proves a universal, enduring historical truth. Absolute state power, with all its armies, its surveillance, and its immense wealth, cannot crush true moral authority. His resilience remains a universal blueprint for surviving tyranny without losing one's soul.
Which brings us to a final striking historical irony to mull over. Harun al-Rashid was unequivocally the most powerful man on earth at that time.
Without a doubt.
He commanded armies that stretched from North Africa to Central Asia. He had virtually unlimited wealth. Yet today, his glittering, abased palaces have turned to dust. You can't even find exactly where some of them stood.
Completely erased.
Meanwhile, the man he kept chained in a dark dungeon, the man who owned nothing and died in isolation, was buried in a modest grave in the Quraysh cemetery. And over the centuries, that grave drew millions of people, eventually growing into the massive, thriving city of Kadimiyya. Millions gather there today just to whisper his name. It forces you to ask yourself, centuries from now, does history remember the people who wielded the power or the people who endured it?
That is a profound question.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.